Yes, Mr. Isle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I foreshadowed I was going on to a different topic, but I just want to pick up two final questions on the last topic with Professor Sutton. Professor, just before the break, in answer to the question I asked you about your state of mind on the 27th of March and your preferred position, you said that you were supportive of National Cabinet's determination that all return travellers should be in hotel quarantine. Just want to unpack that for a moment. Was it your preferred position that all return travellers be in hotel quarantine for 14 days?
Yes.
Was there any consideration given, as far as you're aware, to a more tailored and individual-specific approach?
Through National Cabinet, do you mean, or in discussions with AHPPC?
Well, first of all, let me ask you about your preferred view. Did you have a preferred view that individuals should be treated as individuals, or if you just enter this country, it's 14 days?
I think, given where we were at with the pandemic in Australia, the rapidly rising numbers of cases, and the likelihood that control of numbers would get beyond us in a relatively short period of time, it was my view that the initial implementation of hotel quarantine should be for all travellers, especially given the emergent risk in countries where we didn't necessarily see that risk until it arrived on our shores. You'd be aware that after restricting travel from mainland China into Australia, or a recommendation that all of those from mainland China quarantine at home, countries such as Italy, Iran and South Korea were added to that list. But it took some time for consideration of the United Kingdom and the United States. But we did see a number of travellers arriving who were clearly infected in those countries. And so one of the considerations about not discriminating with a kind of risk stratified approach is that it's very difficult to know what's been identified within a country. Are they testing enough? Have they identified whether there is significant transmission? What we know one week doesn't look the same the following week. So I think, initially, that broad approach to quarantining everyone was certainly one that I supported.
And first of all, was that quarantining for 14 days?
Yes, it was.
So not a situation where you would consider receiving a person into quarantine and then making an evidence-based risk assessment of that person?
No.
And you've said now a couple of times, initially that was your view. Did your view change over time?
Certainly we've had continuing discussions nationally about other potential approaches to mandatory quarantine that attempts to risk stratify and to do so on the basis, for example, of country of origin, how much testing is being done there and what the prevalence might be in those countries. Obviously, there have been discussions with New Zealand about a travel bubble and an exemption to that quarantine process. And I'm aware of other Western Pacific nations like the Solomon Islands, like Vanuatu, that appear to be free of COVID-19. And so I think going forward, it's not unreasonable to look at a risk stratified approach, but it really does depend on where a jurisdiction is at with respect to transmission in that jurisdiction. And each and every one of our jurisdictions, state and territories, risk tolerance for having even a single case emerge from hotel quarantine and potentially bring virus to the community. If we are in a situation like Europe, home quarantine is a very reasonable approach to take, because there is no way that they're going to get to zero community transmission. But with much of Australia already at that level, and with the potential prospect of the whole of Australia getting to that point, the tolerance for having 1 in 1,000 or even 1 in 10,000 travellers, knowing how many come through each week, bringing coronavirus to the community is probably extremely low, and they wouldn't like it in another jurisdiction with the prospect of then not being able to assure open borders or free travel across the country. So I think it's not out of the question, and there are probably ways to mitigate the risk very substantially with testing, with other mechanisms of ensuring compliance with home quarantine, but it hasn't been explored in full or agreed nationally, which is really a key consideration for me.
Which is the key consideration, that it hasn't been explored in full or that it hasn't been agreed nationally?
Both, really. I think we need to understand the emerging epidemiology within Australia, but also globally, and how that intersects with whatever future quarantine program might be modelled. But also that national agreement is an important approach to this as much as anything.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about risk stratifying, you were talking about where people had been travelling from. Was there any consideration given to individualised approaches based on clinical information, such as symptomology, such as positive or negative tests being returned, and therefore potentially allowing people to come out of quarantine earlier, not only just based on where they were from, but based on whether they had tested positive or not, or in fact returned a negative test and or were not showing symptoms? Was there any kind of consideration for that, or was it just a blanket 14 days from the start?
Initially, it was a blanket 14 days. It obviously remained a blanket 14 days for the duration of hotel quarantine in Victoria until the program was essentially put on hold. And in large part, it's because testing cannot tell you that you won't develop symptoms in that 14-day period. If you're tested on day 3 or day 5 or day 7, it can tell you that you haven't developed illness in that 7-day period, which is when the majority of people develop illness, but it won't tell you about the remaining 7 days and the 10 or 20 or 25% of people who might still become unwell in that subsequent week. And so going the entire 14 days is the only absolute assurance or relatively strong assurance you can have that someone isn't infectious. You can, of course, do a symptom check on a daily basis, but as I said, there are some individuals who will have very mild symptoms, others who will develop it right on the 13th or 14th day, others who might minimise their symptoms, and a small percentage who will become infected and remain completely free of symptoms. They are probably not much of a risk of transmission to others, but there is known to be transmission from asymptomatic individuals. So no guarantees, essentially, and a blanket approach is the only one that gives that high-level assurance.
Mm-hmm. I understand that's the reasoning behind it, but coming back to my question, was there any consideration given to that type of nuanced or tailored approach that looked at the individual?
There was, but it was not an approach that was agreed or preferred.
Mm-hmm. Now you've told us your views as of the 27th of March that you're in support of the National Cabinet decision. Are you aware that there was not a consensus view held amongst the other respective Chief Health Officers in that respect?
Yes, I was.
Mm. And what did you understand to be the basis of the contrary views?
Again, I suspect that's Cabinet in confidence, but I really can't speak for other Chief Health Officers with respect to their views.
So just trying to understand, is that an objection to answering the question, or is it, I don't know the answer to the question?
I think it's fair to say I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, then we can move on. Once the decision as to hotel quarantine had been made, we've heard evidence that there was already installed in Victoria under the State Health Emergency Response Plan a state controller.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
There was a state controller already installed in Victoria prior to the decision in respect of hotel quarantine being made.
That's correct.
And that's a state controller who'd been appointed initially in November of 2019. Do you understand that to be the case?
Pandemic. Not
no,
for this pandemic.
Generally the state controller was appointed in November 2019 was Ms. Spiteri.
Yes, for different purposes.
Yes, and there was a document that at least Ms. Skilbeck took us to, which was called a concept of operations document, which is a policy document that sits alongside the SHERP.
That's correct.
Now, that concept of operations document is a document that you had some involvement in drafting, did you not?
I certainly reviewed several versions and provided my edits and inputs and ideas.
And we understand that, at least relying on the terms of that document, that is the concept of operations document, Ms. Skilbeck appointed Ms. Spiteri a state controller on the 1st of February of this year in relation to the pandemic response.
That's right.
When I say that Ms. Skilbeck made the appointment, it was the secretary that made the appointment, albeit on Ms. Skilbeck's recommendation.
That's right.
Now, at the time that you were involved in drafting this concept of operations document, which I think was in late 2019 or reviewing parts of it, did you think that should a pandemic occur, it would be likely that you would not be appointed the state controller, notwithstanding the presumption in the SHERP that that be the case?
I don't know that I had a pre-existing view of the probability. I think I imagined the possibility that I might not be appointed, but I wouldn't have said that I expected it to be more likely than not.
Ms. Skilbeck gave evidence to the inquiry last Thursday. Did you follow her evidence at all?
No, not in full.
Okay. At page 1219 of the transcript, Madam Chair, she was asked about her decision to recommend Ms. Spiteri against the presumptive position in the SHERP that you be the state controller. And she told this inquiry that you were not in agreement with that decision. Are you aware that she's given that evidence?
Yes, I am.
And is it correct that you were not in agreement with that decision?
That's right.
Why?
I had a view that the position of state controller is a not insignificant one with respect to the application of controls for the management of an emergency or incident, including a pandemic, and that the position has line of sight of operational elements that I, as Chief Health Officer and accountable with all of the powers that I'm exercising under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, that it's important for me to have line of sight of the application of those controls and to be appropriately aware, to have situational awareness of those operational activities.
The emergency that required the appointment of a state controller was a health emergency.
That's right.
Is it your view, or was it your view then, that it's preferable then to have a state controller, a person with operational line of sight, to have some health expertise?
Andrea Spiteri has some health expertise. She's an excellent leader in the emergency management space within DHHS, so I wouldn't say that she doesn't have health expertise. With respect to a pandemic specifically, I do have a view that a public health physician with communicable disease experience and tropical medicine experience and the specific qualifications and experience that I have is a not inappropriate appointment to the state controller position for sure.
That's a very cautious way in which to say it, not inappropriate. It's preferable, isn't it?
It is to me.
Yes. And they were the views that you held in February?
Yes.
And they're the views that you still hold today?
No, you'd be aware that the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services is the State Controller as of now and has been for some weeks. I think at the juncture that we're in, where there's a whole of Victorian government response of a really extraordinarily complex and large operational response, that as the head of this department and with a deep understanding, oversight and direct reporting of all of the divisions within Health and Human Services, and they are all engaged in this response very deeply, that Ms Peake is an appropriate State Controller at this juncture. In February, my view was different.
In February, I'll ask you a slightly more specific question then. Your view in February was, as this health emergency was then unfolding, it was preferable that someone with your type of experience and your type of training be the State Controller.
Yes, and it's not just about my training and experience. It's about the position that the State Controller sits in within the emergency management arrangements and the oversight of certain operational activities that I think it's important as Chief Health Officer to be across.
Yeah, and you've said that, as I understand it, that you consider Ms Peake as an appropriate person given where we're at in the pandemic response now. But your view now is still that in the initial phases, someone such as you was preferable.
That's right.
Yes. And when those decisions were being made by Ms Skilbeck, that is to make the recommendation to the Secretary, did you express those views and the reasons for it to Ms Skilbeck?
I did. I don't know the extent to which I went into my personal reasoning. I expressed my preference. I certainly spoke to my accountabilities and my sense of accountability with respect to pandemic control. And I think delineated the role that a State Controller is defined as the individual who applies the controls in an incident or emergency and is a decision maker in that regard.
Did you express those views directly to the Secretary?
Not directly to the Secretary, no.
Do you know if your views were brought to her attention?
I don't know. Absolutely no.
Did you express those views to the Minister?
No.
Do you know whether your views were conveyed to the Minister?
I do not know. I don't think so.
In respect of this operational line of sight of which you've spoken, and the need to embed someone with public health experience in the command of the hotel quarantine program, Dr. Romanes has made some observations in a statement that's been tendered before this board. Firstly, have you read Dr. Romanes' statement?
I have.
So you'd be familiar with the part at paragraph 84 where he says, from what I could see, the program was characterised, and first of all, the program he's talking about there is the hotel quarantine program. The program was characterised and managed predominantly as an accommodational logistics program. Do you recall reading that in Dr. Romanes' statement?
I do.
And is that consistent with your observation of the hotel quarantine program, that it was managed predominantly as an accommodational logistics program?
I really didn't have sufficient insights into the management of the quarantine program to form a view.
Do you have a view now?
No, I still haven't seen the historical operational decision-making, planning, preparation, administration, logistics to form a view.
Dr. Romanes goes on, I drew this view from observations of the appointment of senior leadership figures that did not have significant public health experience. Just pausing there for a moment. You're aware that senior leadership figures within the Operation Soteria structure were people that did not have significant public health experience?
Yes.
Dr. Romanes, who was present at some of the Operation Soteria governance meetings, first of all, I understand you were not, but he says the Operation Soteria governance meetings I attended did not involve the Public Health Command initially and did seem to me to focus heavily on logistics considerations. Are you able to comment on that observation he makes at all?
Oh, only that we discussed it, and I took his view as his honest, albeit subjective appraisal of that focus.
And he expressed to you, didn't he, at the time that this was occurring, that which he then reflects upon in his statement at paragraph 84. While the program had significant logistical implementation at that time, these were part of the challenge only, and I felt that a public health consideration needed to be concurrently addressed. Now, first of all, that's a sentiment that he expressed to you at the time?
Yes, it was.
That's a matter that you and he discussed together?
Yes.
And including discussions that were had with the Deputy Chief Health Officer as well?
Correct.
And indeed, you've identified yourself at paragraph 159 of your statement that you held reservations about the lack of involvement of Public Health Command in Operation Soteria.
That's right.
You go on to explain those reservations or contextualise them by saying that you felt an ethical responsibility for the welfare for those that were detained in quarantine. That's at paragraph 159, Madam Chair.
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, this was an issue that the Public Health Command raised specifically with Operation Soteria, did they not?
I believe so.
You were copied into an email dated the 9th of April sent by Dr. Romanes to a number of the senior officials within Operation Soteria.
Yes, I was.
Yes, I'll ask that the document be brought up, Madam Chair. It's document ID DELW.000.0011.2116_R. First of all, if we can just zoom in on the top part of that page, which shows who the email's from, who it was addressed to. You see there, Professor, that this was an email sent by Dr. Romanes on the 9th of April, addressed directly to Ms. Spiteri, who was the State Controller.
Yes.
And to Mr. Eagle, from whom the inquiry heard yesterday, but also CC'd into this email are Pamela Williams, who the inquiries heard from was Operation Soteria Commander or Accommodation Commander, Braden Hogan and Meena Naidu, Merrin Bammett, Annalise Van Diemen, the Deputy Chief Health Officer, and yourself.
Yes.
Now, firstly, do you recall receiving this email?
I do.
And does this email reflect the substance of the conversation that you were having with Dr. Romanes around that time about concerns to do with the governance of Operation Soteria?
I think it's generally reflective and consistent with those conversations. It goes into significantly more granular detail.
If we can highlight the bottom paragraph we see there, the one that starts there appears. It's actually the second substantive paragraph. This is an email, before we go to this, that you would say Dr. Romanes was really sending on behalf of yourself, Ms. or Dr. Van Diemen, and himself. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think so.
You see here he says there appears to be a lack of unified plan for this program, and there is considerable concern that the lead roles have not had an opportunity to be satisfied that there is a policy and set of processes to manage the healthcare and welfare of detainees for whom this program is accountable. First of all, that's something you recall reading in the email?
It is.
And secondly, that accurately reflected the way you were feeling at the time about the program.
Well, as I say, I didn't have direct experience of the program. So my concerns were, in a sense, arising out of my conversations with Dr. Romanis and his direct view, or as a point of liaison, or as a member of the group that met to consider the accommodation concerns.
So based on those things you'd been told by Dr. Romanes, assuming them to be true, that was a view that you held?
Yes.
Yes. We can take that highlight down, and if we can go to the next paragraph and highlight that, please. There are now considerable complexity and considerable risk that unless governance and plan issues are addressed, there will be a risk to health and safety of detainees. Again, is that something, whether it be based on your own observations or what was being reported to you by Dr. Romanes, is an accurate reflection of your state of mind at the time?
Again, just taking Dr. Romanes' reflections and insights on face value, I understood that to be his view.
If we can highlight the next paragraph, please. You see here, Professor, that it says the Chief Health Officer and the Deputy Chief Health Officer are formally requesting an urgent review governance of the mandatory quarantine detention program, also known as Operation Soteria. Were you at that time formally requesting an urgent review?
In discussion with Dr. Romanis prior to that email being sent, I did support this being called out as something that required urgent review. So absolutely, Dr. Romanis was acting on behalf of me in highlighting concerns that he held.
And we've got provided there with those 5 dot points what the arrangements needed to include effectively as a minimum.
That's
you agree
right.
with that?
Yes.
And just finally, if we can highlight the section that appears under Plan for Mandatory Quarantine Program, aka Operation Soteria, towards the bottom of the page. The Chief Health Officer and Deputy Chief Health Officer require a single plan to be produced for review by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Friday, 10 April. The plan must include, and again, we have some dot points. Final paragraph there, the plan will need to show all processes and policy decisions and manage health and safety of detainees. Again, based on the discussions you had, that was an accurate reflection of what you thought was required, but at that point missing.
Yes, again, on the basis of the insights that Dr. Romanis had into some of the challenges within hotel quarantine, primarily related to health and welfare issues. These were things that he felt required an urgent review and consolidation.
You say he felt, and you endorsed his position on
I
those.
did.
Yes.
I did.
I tendered the document, Madam Chair. That can come off the screen.
Exhibit 158.
That email was an email sent by Dr. Romanes, but drawing on the full force of your office as Chief Health Officer, wasn't it?
It was.
It highlighted the urgency of the situation.
Yes.
And effectively required immediate remedial action.
Yes.
Yes. And you identify Professor, in your statement that sometime during the process of the Operation Soteria operation that a public health command liaison position was created.
That's right.
When did that come to fruition?
I think it was in the development of this plan. It wasn't landed by 10 a.m. the following day, and I think that was a pretty high expectation. There is a lot of complexity in that program, as I understand it, and there was a lot to work through. But my understanding is that Dr. Van Diemen, in discussions with the State Controller, came to the conclusion that a division of responsibilities with the Emergency Operations Centre having primary focus on the logistic and operational aspects of the hotel quarantine program, and public health having carriage of the policies and guidance with respect to health and welfare, infection control and the like.
I'll come back to the question. Do you know when that position was created?
I don't know specifically. I believe it did come out of an agreement between Dr. Van Diemen and the State Controller shortly after that.
But notwithstanding, I mean, that email was effectively demanding, was it not, that public health have a seat at the Operation Soteria table?
Yes.
And have some operational line of sight as to what was actually happening from a health perspective.
That's correct.
And the result of those demands was the creation of the Public Health Command liaison role.
That's correct.
And even that, you say in your statement, was not an optimal way of getting line of sight into the operation of the program with respect to health and welfare.
That's right. I think clearly the liaison role was able to sit on meetings where a number of issues and concerns about arising from the program were raised, but it is not the same as having direct oversight and direct view of the daily challenges and operational complexities of that program, which I understood to be substantial. And I think in many ways, the public health view and the public health expertise with respect to that would have been beneficial to be more directly engaged.
Because, for example, if we take your position, Professor Sutton, you weren't aware that there were difficulties or problems with the infection prevention control measures until after the outbreaks. That's a fair summation, isn't it? And indeed, you weren't even aware that private security were being used in the hotel quarantine program until after the outbreaks.
That's correct.
In that vein, you, in your capacity as Chief Health Officer, made 2 formal requests of the Chief Commissioner of Police for assistance. Did you not?
I did.
Now, the first of those was on 16th of March. That was before there was any conceived hotel quarantine program. The second of those requests was made on the 29th of March, the day after hotel quarantine had become operational. What did that request entail?
It was essentially formalising my desire to mobilise police to support authorised officers in the exercise of their functions to the extent that was feasible.
What type of support were you envisaging there?
I was envisaging, I mean, it was for those who were engaged in the operations to really determine at the coalface what those specific elements of assistance might be, but the follow-up of those individuals in isolation at home and or in quarantine at home was a specific concern of mine, because I wanted to really see that there would be some opportunity for checking in and or compliance and enforcement measures as appropriate.
Just one moment. So did you have any preconceived idea when you sent that request about whether police would be involved actually at the hotel?
No, not a preconceived idea. It was very much, in flux.
That was something you left to those that were effectively running the operation?
Yes.
We touched upon before the fact that you weren't aware of the engagement of private security until after the outbreaks. You were able, were you not, to see the risks created by the use of that workforce, that is private security?
Yes, absolutely. In retrospect, there are a number of vulnerabilities with respect to transmission risk because of that workforce, and that's not to impugn or vilify any individual involved in that, but the demographics of that workforce cohort provide for significant risks of transmission within the community. The casualised labour that was involved meant that a number of them had other work that they needed to do, which brought the risk of transmission to other workplaces and other individuals. The casualised nature of their work and the dependency they had on that work led to an incentive to stay at work, both in hotel quarantine work, but in their other work, I would imagine, while potentially symptomatic, even potentially while diagnosed and aware of that diagnosis. I'm aware that there were potential cultural and language issues with respect to understanding the policies and procedures of physical distancing and the broader infection prevention and control measures that were in place. And I think there may well have been issues about the identification of their close contacts because it effectively takes them out of the workforce for a 14-day period if they're identified. I can't speak to whether that was actually at play for a number of these staff, but in retrospect, it's clear that there must have been close contacts who were not identified, because we're aware that this virus extended to the broad community without a clear epidemiological link back to the staff at hotel quarantine, which means that there are unidentified close contacts in that chain who were never raised as close contacts with the outbreak management team.
So, Professor, you're an expert in public health.
I hope so.
We all do.
Good.
You're an expert in communicable diseases.
Yes.
You can readily see some of the difficulties or risks created by the use of that workforce in this setting.
Yes.
And no one asked you your opinion before private security were brought in to be the first line in hotel quarantine, were you?
No, recognising that it was a decision made within hours of that announcement out of National Cabinet, and presumably without a recognition of some of these public health issues that we're all acutely aware of after the fact.
And presumably also then, Professor, without the input of any public health experts or communicable diseases experts.
As far as I'm aware, not.
You recall when these issues were first brought to your attention, you expressed a view that this was really the wrong cohort of workers to be engaged in this type of work. Do you recall that?
I don't know if I used those words, but I think I certainly highlighted some of the challenges that I've just mentioned with respect to the risk of transmission to the broader community and indeed amongst the workforce itself.
Can Can we bring up document DHS.50000.0034.6968_R? Now, Professor, this is a chain of emails which includes emails passing between yourself and Professor Brendan Murphy on the 20th of June. If we can go to the third page, please. And just to put this in context, highlight that top paragraph. We'll see when we scroll back, Professor, that this is an email sent by Brendan Murphy to yourself on the 19th of June at 8:26 p.m, where he says, been reflecting on the quarantine breaches we have had and the issues raised by Annalise. That's a reference to Dr. Van Diemen. Today, where a hotel worker continued to work while symptomatic and didn't identify, etc., etc. And Dr. Murphy, Professor Murphy, I apologise, asked the question about whether it's possible to pay these workers their normal weekly hours for the 2-week period that they're required to quarantine. Do you recall receiving this email?
I do vaguely, yes.
If we can go back to page 2, the bottom email there, the substance of that email. Now that's a follow-on email that Professor Murphy has again sent to yourself and to Dr. Van Diemen, saying to you, the other thing I was wondering is whether there is anything we can do to help your enhancement of infection control. He goes on to say, do we need to do more, up the training and supervision, etc., etc. Do you recall receiving that email?
I do.
And if we can just scroll up then, in response to that email, about 20 minutes later, sorry, that's Murphy again. You see, no, before Murphy responds to you, thanks, Brendan. We've got good training and IPC supervision, but the workforce is the wrong cohort. That's you expressing to Professor Murphy precisely what I just took you to, isn't it? That your recognition that this private security workforce was simply the wrong cohort.
Yes.
And in response, what Professor Murphy sends back to you is that if you need a short-term surge workforce in the meantime, Aspen, first of all, who are Aspen?
Aspen are a private medical organisation that provide medical human resources as required.
Or even ADF. Did you take that to mean the Australian Defence Force?
I did.
Could help at very short notice. Did you understand really that what Professor Murphy was offering there was to give you at least a short-term surge workforce to assist with that wrong cohort that you'd identified?
Yes.
And specifically focusing in on that, the very short notice that would be required to be able to deploy Australian Defence Force personnel.
Yes.
Did you convey that offer made by Professor Murphy to you to anyone else?
I don't recall doing so. I knew that Dr. Van Diemen, as Public Health Commander, was in copy and that she was aware of this offer and this issue, and she was the individual in a position in Public Health Command to liaise as we've raised earlier with the Operation Soteria program.
You can just scroll over to the bottom of the next page, please. Your response on the 21st of June is, thanks, Brendan. Merrin, which is a reference to Ms. Bammett, in copy, is overseeing the operation. I'm sure we'll touch base as required. I think Aspen in particular could strengthen the program, but it's security staffing that is our main risk at the moment. Do you know what, if anything, was done around that late period of June in respect of private security in the hotel quarantine program to address those problems that you were talking of?
I'm aware in general terms that the outbreak squads, the outbreak management team, the infection prevention and control cell within our public health incident management team, we're looking at all of the elements that might be required to respond to the risks that they identified in responding to the outbreaks.
Yes, I tendered the document, Madam Chair.
The series of emails, Mr. R.
Series of emails. The last two I haven't gone to, but in the series, there's probably no reason why they ought not also be tendered. It's DHS.5000.0034.6968, a series of emails between the 19th of June and the 21st of June, including those to which we've just referred.
Thank you. Exhibit 159.
The board pleases. Professor, I just want to ask you about the concept of a COVID positive or so-called hot hotel. Do I understand correctly from your statement that the idea of designating a particular hotel within the program as a COVID positive hotel was not a matter discussed with you prior to that decision being made?
No, it wasn't directly discussed with me.
Do you know whether it was discussed? Sorry, I'll withdraw that. Going back to the question of oversight, the Public Health Command, of which we've discussed, that's not, they're not a team that had oversight in relation to the operational aspects of Operation Soteria. Do you agree with that?
I do.
That they wrote the policies and then others went and implemented them.
Correct.
You say in your statement at paragraph 152 that the idea of a COVID positive or hot hotel clearly represented a risk of transmission from quarantined individuals to contracted staff.
Yes.
And that's something as a public health expert and a communicable diseases expert would have been readily apparent at the time that decision was made to you.
A hot hotel being a greater risk than
yes.
a pure quarantine hotel, yes.
Yes. You go on to say that had you been consulted, you would allow specific infection prevention control measures to be adopted to take into account that increased risk.
Yes.
What types of things would you have recommended had you been asked?
Well, I'm not an infection prevention and control expert. I would have absolutely gotten the input of the IPC team and the broader groups that they engage with around what step-up level of infection prevention and control might be required. But in general terms, the requirements for PPE would be higher because you're dealing with known positive cases or suspected cases, and that you would try and make infrastructural and structural elements to minimise the risk of transmission. So structural elements that create a greater distance between those staff supporting the program and anyone who is a client of the program, that you would stratify the zones where those positive individuals are separately to staff, that ventilation and flow would all be addressed, and that you would have stringent measures with respect to cleaning and disinfection, and the oversight of all of those elements in terms of training and auditing and review and revision.
Yes, just one moment. Yes, thank you, Professor. Just one final topic that I want to take you to, and I just want to get this sequence right. In your statement, you say that the AHPPC did not endorse hotel quarantine program prior to the announcement of National Cabinet.
Correct.
The decision was made by National Cabinet, and the AHPPC still did not endorse or make that recommendation.
They didn't come to an agreement on it, no.
Yes. You would agree that the detention orders that were made in respect of those returned travellers were a necessary element of giving effect to the National Cabinet decision?
Correct.
And the powers to order detention and isolation are powers that vest in you personally under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, irrespective of whether there's a state of emergency.
For individuals, yes.
And they vest within you under the Biosecurity Act as well.
Correct.
In your role, one of your functions is to authorised officers under Section 199.
Correct.
Does that mean that you yourself are not an authorised officer?
My belief is that I'm also an authorised officer.
Okay. Well, why was it the case then, Professor, that you didn't issue the detention notices and that you left that instead to the Deputy Chief Health Officer, Dr. Van Diemen?
My understanding was that legal opinion was that there was some potential ambiguity in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act at that time that made it not entirely clear whether I had the power to issue those directions as an authorised officer.
Well, they're the directions under Section 200, but you had the power to make directions under other provisions as the Chief Health Officer, didn't you?
Yes.
But you chose not to use those ones.
I didn't choose anything. The advice of our senior legal representatives in the department was that I should have an authorised officer sign those directions for the avoidance of any doubt with respect to the Act.
Okay. And that's just based on legal advice?
Correct.
Yes. Thank you. Professor, that concludes the questions that I have for you. May I say, and I see that we already have Mr. Moses on screen, I have had notice of an application by Unified Security, but I've also had notice of an application by the Department of Justice and Community Safety. But perhaps given Mr. Moses has joined us, I'll call on him in the first instance.
Madam Chair, can I just raise one matter? In the course of Professor Sutton giving evidence, I think Mr. Moses's instructors have notified us of a further document they wish to take him to. Obviously, that's not been possible, as is the anticipation in the practice directions, to raise with him in advance. It may be that it would be appropriate for us to have some time to actually see what they wish to tender or to deal with Professor Sutton first. There might be some overlap with other documents previously notified, but on my quick assessment of that email from Mr. Moses' instructors, it does look like they've just notified something new.
Yes, Madam Chair. The document is DHS 0001 00121504. The Professor gave evidence about this document, which is the Public Health and Wellbeing Act 2008, request for assistance from the Chief Health Officer to the Chief Commissioner of Police. It's just the document that he referred to in his evidence.
So, Mr. Moses, do you mean the document that's now become Exhibit 159?
No, Madam Chair, that's the email chain. So this is a different document. Counsel assisting asked some questions of the witness in respect to the request for assistance to the Chief Commissioner of Police. I'm just taking the witness to the document, which is part of the exhibits that are relevant to Professor. It's DHS 0001 00121504. And my learned friend, Ms. Harris, is correct. It was sent whilst he was giving his evidence because it was something that arose during the course of his evidence. That's why, as my learned friend would know as counsel and as an advocate, sometimes these issues arise when witnesses are giving their evidence. It can't be done in a way that is dealt with before somebody gives their evidence. I think she would appreciate that.
Do you want to say anything about that, Ms. Harris? Have you got access to that document now?
I'm trying, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, I'm having problems with the online hearing book at present.
I'm coming to that, Madam Chair, if I assist my friend right now anyway. There are just some short questions I need to ask the witness, and I can assure my friend that if by the time I get to that issue, I won't be very long with my questions to the Professor, then I will stop and ensure that my friend has it. If she hasn't got it, then I won't ask the question.
Madam Chair, perhaps I can assist in this regard. That's a document, as I understand it, that was annexed to Professor Sutton's statement in any event, and a document which had been identified as one that Professor Sutton may have been taken to today. So whilst I understand Ms Harris's concerns, no doubt she's seen that document because it was foreshadowed as a document that I was intending to take the Professor to, but that wasn't required in the instance.
Madam Chair, if that's the case, I don't know the document numbers off by heart, so I wasn't sure that was going to be something I had seen before, but I will be able to see that from Professor Sutton's exhibits. Thank you.
I just think Ms Harris is only suspicious of me. But, okay, thank you.
So you're making you have an application for leave to cross-examine Mr. Moses.
I do, and I've notified our learned friend, counsel assisting in respect of those topics that we wish to put to Professor Sutton in relation to his evidence. There are aspects of it that have fallen away as a result of the examination by counsel assisting. So the first one related to the decision-making process concerning the appointment of authorised officers to deal with the detention of people in the hotel quarantine program. That issue has fallen away, but for this issue, and that is what, if any, assessment was undertaken by the Professor in relation to what he understood was going to be the capability of the authorised officers to exercise powers to detain people under the statutory framework. I think I know the answer to that question, but I will put the question formally to him. The other questions that we had highlighted related to Exhibit 159, and that is, when did Professor Sutton begin to have concerns about whether the model adopted in respect of hotel quarantine programs was appropriate with respect to the use of security in hotels? And the other issue related to the use of hotels, as I call it, as red hotels in respect of putting COVID-19 patients or people with that infection in there, and whether any consideration was given to the welfare of the workers as well as those under detention. So that they were the range of areas. I should be quite brief because counsel assisting has covered most of the issues that we wanted to cover.
All right. I'll grant you that leave, Mr. Moses. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Sutton, you've taken us to your key roles and responsibilities at paragraph 11 of your statement, but in short, do you agree that your first and highest obligation is the health and safety of the public in accordance with the powers that you have?
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. And counsel assisting has already taken you to paragraph 109 of your statement, but the question that I wanted to ask you was this: in relation to the appointment of authorised officers to exercise powers which would include the detention of citizens, did you undertake any review yourself as to how they would go about detaining individuals? That is, what capability did they have?
In the course of authorising all authorised officers, and I think they probably number in their hundreds at this point in time, I always receive a memo detailing the process of selection and the credentials or competencies as assessed by the program area. And so it's in reading that memo and having that assurance from the program area that they believe that the skills and competencies, and they're delineated in general terms, are appropriate for the exercise of those specific powers for which they're authorised.
Thank you. And in paragraph 261 of your statement, you say that you struggle to find the number of appropriately qualified authorised officers required for the roles, correct?
That's correct.
And in respect of that struggle, did you consider that if there weren't appropriately qualified authorised officers, that perhaps the hotel quarantine program should have been delayed in order that you be able to have appropriately qualified authorised officers to execute the very important role, which was involved in being responsible for detaining persons against their will?
I certainly understood those pressures to come to bear on the operation of the program. But again, as someone who wasn't a decision maker or oversighting that program, I think they were matters for the program area to determine how they might need to scale back, either in terms of the numbers of international arrivals or the allocation of arrivals across various Australian jurisdictions.
And to be fair to you, though, that was not something that you were directly involved in. I think you say that in paragraph 119 of your statement, that you were not directly involved in the operational planning, approving or running of the hotel quarantine program.
That's correct.
Can I ask you, and I'm not being critical at all, because there's been some confusion in the inquiry as to who was responsible for what. Who did you understand was responsible for running the hotel quarantine program as the Chief Health Officer?
I understood it to be Operation Soteria Commander.
Okay, thank you. Now, Professor, can I just go to your evidence concerning security guards? You say that the first time you became aware that security guards were being used was after the outbreaks and from media reports. This is in paragraph 156 of your statement.
Yes.
And can we assume then from that evidence that you were not informed that by authorised officers or anybody else that prior to the media reports about the outbreaks that security guards were being used by authorised officers in order to assist in their detention of individuals? Is that a safe assumption to make?
It's some of the allegations about the security guards made in the media that was the first time that came to my attention. But the use of security guards obviously came to my attention as soon as the outbreaks occurred, and they were reported through the outbreak management team.
But that was at that point that you became aware for the first time that private security firms were being used, correct?
That's correct.
And had you been aware that they were being used at the commencement of the hotel quarantine program, would you have raised the same concerns about security guards being used that you raised in Exhibit 159 that Council Assisting took you to, which is email between yourself and Professor Murphy on or about the 21st of June?
I don't think so. I think the wisdom we have in hindsight is a key element here. I'm not sure anyone at the point in time of decision-making around hotel quarantine commencement might have been able to foreshadow some of the complexities of that workforce. I certainly wouldn't have had sufficient familiarity with it to have made some of the conclusions that I can make now by virtue of having seen some of those complexities play out. I would have obviously brought a public health view, but I certainly couldn't say that I would have had the same level of concerns or understood what those concerns to be back at that point in time in late March.
Thank you. And can we assume that by 21 June 2020, the position as it involved the hotel quarantine program was, as you've set out in your affidavit, your statement, I apologise, in paragraph 119, that you continued not to be involved in the operational planning, approving or running of the hotel quarantine program, or had that changed after the outbreak?
No, I wasn't personally involved, but I was aware that there was even stronger engagement with the Public Health Incident Management Team, the Infection Prevention and Control Cell, Public Health Commander and others of relevance.
Thank you, Professor. Madam Chair, could the witness have, and could this be placed on the screen, Exhibit 159, which is the email chain that Council Assisting tendered, the one of the 21st of June. There's just two questions that I want to raise with the witness arising out of something in his email, the 21st of June, sent at 10:06, 12 a.m. on the Sunday.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It might be helpful, Mr. Moses, to the operator, excuse me, to give a document identification number rather than an exhibit number.
I apologise, Madam Chair. It's DHS 5000 0034 6968. Professor, just at the bottom of that email chain, you'll see that in response to an email sent by Professor Murphy, and by all means, if you wanted to refresh your memory, you can go to what you were responding to. What you said in the email the 21st of June was this. I just want to highlight the second sentence. I think, and it continues, in particular, could strengthen the program, but it's security staffing that is our main risk at the moment. Do you see that?
I do.
If you were not involved in relation to, if I can refer to it as the operational planning, approving or running of the hotel quarantine program by June, what did you form the view that security staffing was the main risk at the moment? That is, what did you form? What was the basis of that statement? Are you able to help us?
It was really out of the observations of the outbreak squads and the report of the outbreak management team that identified a number of issues with respect to awareness and practice of infection prevention and control elements within those hotels. Some of that related to physical distancing. Some of that seemed to relate to the inappropriate use of PPE or the lack of PPE being worn when it should have been. And so it was largely around the outbreak management reports that I formed that view.
And again, not being critical of you, but in respect of those reports that were coming to you, is that because those were reports that were coming because what had happened, if I can refer to it as the outbreak at the Ridges and the Stanford, that had caused there to be a spike in those who had contracted COVID-19? That is why those were being sent to you.
I receive outbreak management reports on a routine basis. So any setting that develops an outbreak would be routinely circulated to a number of people, including myself.
Thank you. What I want to suggest to you, Professor, is that quite apart from what you have noted as security staffing being our main risk at the moment, I wanted to put to you directly that what in fact was the main risk in relation to what was occurring in respect of the outbreaks at the Ridges and the Stanford was there not being sufficient infection control measures in place. Do you accept that?
Yes.
And do you accept, based on what you now know, is that there were problems in respect of cleaners not being properly trained in cleaning hotels that had COVID-19 positive individuals in there? Do you accept that?
Madam Chair, before Professor Sutton answers that question. I object to that question on the basis that the professor has given quite clear evidence that he had no involvement in the operational details of the program.
I think that's a fair objection. I think that's a fair objection, Madam Chair. But the point that we're trying to make is that the professor's made a statement in the email the 21st of June about security staffing, and what we're trying to elicit is whether he knew about the issue concerning the cleaners. If his evidence is he wasn't aware of that, then that's fine. But if he's saying that he turned his mind to it at the time he sent the email and still proceeded to make the statement that he did, then that's a different proposition.
Yeah, so I think the objection then is well put, Mr. Moses. It's the question before it that you need to ask.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Sutton, in respect of your knowledge of what cleaning was being used at hotels, and in particular I want to focus on Ridges, who had the COVID-19 positive individuals there, were you aware prior to 21 June 2020 what cleaning was being undertaken at the Ridges Hotel?
No.
And were you aware prior to the 21st of June 2020 which worker was the first worker to contract COVID-19 at the Ridges?
I don't think any of us can determine which worker was the first worker to
subject to a non-publication order has now been identified in that question, and I'd ask that those that are managing the public broadcast be sensitive to that.
Yes, and I'll give that direction, Mr. R.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the record, it's DHS 0001 0036 0147. And the point that I wanted to make in respect of this, Professor, whether you agree with this, is that what Professor Brendan Murphy was raising in the email, which is the last page on the email chain, was a concern in relation to a hotel worker who continued to work while symptomatic and didn't identify because of fear of income loss. That the concern being raised by Professor Brendan Murphy wasn't just limited to security workers, but also hotel workers. You understood that to be the case, correct?
I don't think I considered the specifics of whom it might apply to.
Okay. Because if you go to the last page of the email chain, Exhibit 159, you'll see that what the professor was raising was being reflecting on the quarantine breaches where we've had in the issue raised by Annalise today where a hotel worker continued to work while symptomatic and didn't identify because of a fear of income loss. Is it possible to write into the hotel quarantine contracts a provision that any hotel or security worker, and then it continues? So at the time you read this email, is it fair to say that what you focused on was the issue of security workers rather than what Professor Murphy was raising, which is also hotel workers?
Commissioner, I raise an objection to the questions that are being asked. It's Mr Woods here on behalf of Ridges Hotels. My learned friend, Mr Moses, I would assume knows well that whatever is said in that email, the true state of affairs, as is known to the Commission, is that a hotel employee, once symptomatic and not at work, did not return to work. And that's at odds with the evidence that's before the Commission with the behaviour of security guards. And I'd ask that that be confirmed, because the way that this is being put at this stage is that this is reflective of the true state of affairs, and it's known to the Commission and to Mr Moses that that's simply not the case.
Your Honour, I'm not sure what that objection is. That issue is a matter dealt with submissions. My learned friend is no doubt open to advance submissions or put questions, but raising objection.
I think the objection is that there's an incorrect factual basis for the way in which the question is put. Is that right, Mr Woods?
That's correct, Commissioner. What the question implies is that this is reflective of the true state of affairs, and it's well known that this is not the true state of affairs. The evidence that's before the Commission is clear that a hotel employee, while not working, was symptomatic and did not return to work. Now, I don't want it to be put or it to be implied in the question, as I submit it was, that this is reflective of the true state of affairs, because it's not.
Yep. Madam Chair, it's a bit of an unusual objection. All I've asked is, asked the witness when he read the email, it's about that point in time, did he confine his understanding of it to security workers? I think my learned friend for Ridges well knows what I am putting, and I think the objection that's been taken, with all due respect to him, is misconceived. And if he can put submissions at the end of the case, but this is not about putting anything positive to the witness other than what's in the email and his state of mind at the time of responding, that the main risk was security staffing. That's the point. And I think my friend would well know that if one takes a step back and look at objectively what I was putting. So I pressed the question, Madam Chair, which was, at the time he read the email, did he focus on the issue of security workers because he overlooked the reference to hotel workers, or was there a reason why he was referring to security staffing as the main risk? That was the proposition.
All right, I'll allow that question, Mr Moses.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Professor, just in respect of that last email in Exhibit 1459, when you read that, and then you responded, as you did in the email chain you'll see on the 21st of June, ultimately, by saying that security staffing is our main risk at the moment. When you responded, was that deliberate, or was it because you had not turned your mind to also what Professor Brendan Murphy was raising about hotel workers also being a concern?
I'm afraid I can't recall what might have been in my mind in responding at that time.
No, that's fine, Professor. I'm not being critical. I just wanted to understand where that came from, lest that comes into some significance at the end of the case, at the end of the inquiry. The one final issue I wanted to raise with you was something concerning the Ridges Hotel, where COVID-19 guests were. The case is at the moment, and please, if you don't know, please say so, that the Brady Hotel is being used for COVID-19 cases, and that has, in effect, assistance being given there by Alfred Health in respect of a comprehensive clinical approach there. Do you understand that to be the case?
I do.
And did you have any role at all as the Chief Health Officer in the establishment of what is currently going on at the Brady Hotel with the Barfoot Health?
No.
And again, then can we also assume that in respect of the Ridges being used as the hotel for COVID-19 positive cases, that was not something that you were involved in making that decision, correct?
That's correct.
The final question I wanted to ask you is this. Do you think, sitting here today, that in respect of COVID-19 positive cases, that rather than quarantining them in a hotel, if the health system could accommodate it, would it be best that they be quarantined in an infectious diseases ward? Would that be the best practice? Sitting here today?
I think if the capacity is there in terms of the space and the human resources required, that it's clear that a clinical setting provides a higher level of clinical care and infection and prevention control than might occur outside of that setting. That's uncontroversial.
Thank you, Professor. Madam Chair and Professor, thank you for your patience. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Moses.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The foreshadowed application by Counsel for the Department of Justice and Community Safety has been withdrawn, but there is a new application by Counsel for the Chief Commissioner of Police. So I call on Ms. Davidson.
Just let me check with Professor Sutton. Professor Sutton, we'd normally be taking the lunch break now. I'm not quite sure how much is left, but are you okay to continue at the moment?
If I collapse, you'll see.
Hopefully we're only talking about another 10 minutes or so.
Absolutely fine.
All right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The issue I'd seek leave to ask Professor Sutton about relates to the, it was referred to as a request on the 29th of March, the formal request for assistance from Victoria Police, and I'd seek to ask some clarifying questions in relation to that.
Yes, I'll grant you that leave, Ms. Davidson.
Thank you. Professor Sutton, there was, as I understand it, an initial request to Victoria Police on the 16th of March.
Correct.
I wonder if you can be shown that request. It is DHS.500.0055.3884. And Professor Sutton, do you sort of recall the issues around the requests for assistance and what needed to be done from a legal perspective in order for police to be able to provide assistance to enforce directions that you had made?
Yeah, I don't recall the exact legal nuance involved. My understanding at the time of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act is that authorised officers can make a verbal request of Victoria Police to assist in the application of powers that they hold as authorised officers. I think there was, I recall that there was some concern as to that not being sufficiently clear as a power of authorised officers, and that it would be of assistance to clarify the request formally with respect to police assisting AOs.
Certainly. And so, for example, in this case, the request here is in relation to directions that had been made dated the 16th of March 2020.
Yes.
And presumably those directions were had the potential to expire, is that right? They were about to expire? for anyone, say, that had been quarantining for 14 days?
I don't.
What days are you referring to, Ms. Davidson? Because the quarantine program didn't start, obviously hadn't started as at the 16th of March.
Certainly. Maybe I could clarify with Professor Sutton that there had been directions for people to quarantine at home. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And police were involved in assisting and checking on those people and making sure that they were home. There were other sort of powers in relation to other directions that had been made that police that needed a specific power to enforce under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so at this time, on the 16th of March, you've got a number of people who are quarantining at home, and there were reports in the media, obviously, about people not complying with those directions. Is that correct?
That's right.
And police were involved in assisting you in terms of enforcing those directions.
I believe so.
And so this direction, if this was concerned with directions that had been made on the 16th of March, this particular request for assistance.
Yes.
And of course, you subsequently made a number of other
directions.
A number of other directions that needed some sort of power for police. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's right.
And then if I can ask that, and I'll ask that you be, if you can just take a note that the request there is really limited to a sentence, and it relates to directions made under Section 200 of the Act. But if I can ask that you then be shown the request that was made on the 29th of March, which is DHS.0001.0012.1504. And this was a request dated the 29th of March. And I think in answer to the question that you were asked about this, you said that you were envisaging that police would follow up individuals at home, and you gave an answer in relation to that. I'm sorry, I don't think I can access the online transcript at the moment, but is your expectation that this new direction was to replace the old one on the 16th of March? Is that your understanding?
I honestly can't read it from the screen, and my recollection is unclear. It might have been to replace, it might have been to provide additional clarity and detail around the exact request.
Okay. So there is some additional clarity in relation to this request. So it says this request includes but is not limited to any actions that police officers need to take to monitor compliance with the directions, investigate and respond to alleged breaches of the directions, and where it is determined that persons have failed to comply with directions without lawful excuse, to take any necessary enforcement action by taking steps to compel compliance and or by issuing fines or charging people for breaching Section 203 of the Act, or any other steps lawfully available to them. Do you recall that there was this further direction that provided much greater clarity and
yes,
assurance to Victoria Police in relation to their powers?
Yes, I do.
And I know it's dated the 29th of March, would you agree that that date is really, in some respects, coincidental? It wasn't a request that police assist specifically with the hotel quarantine program, was it?
No, not at all.
No, it was a direction to, it was a request to ensure that police had sufficient powers to enforce compliance of all of the directions that were being given in relation to this public health emergency.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that in writing this, I'm not providing police any powers that they didn't previously have, but it is a request that provides clarity around the powers of authorised officers to request the assistance of police in the execution of those powers as AOs.
Thank you, Professor Sutton. I've got no further questions, Madam Chair.
And Professor Sutton, did you get a response to those requests?
I can't recall. I presume I did. I'm happy to search for that.
I'll ask you to do that if you wouldn't mind, and get in touch with Mr. Isle after you've done those searches.
Shall do so.
You may be able to assist Ms. Davidson with respect to the responses to those requests. I'd ask you to do that too, please.
I can, Madam Chair. My understanding is this is a formality that needs to happen in order for police to be able to, on an individual basis, on a day-to-day basis, enforce direction. So it may not be something that there is a general response to, but rather something that police just respond to by responding to the request for assistance on a day-to-day basis when authorised officers ask for it.
All right, but you'll check that,
follow that up,
please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Isle.
Just to clarify that last issue, if I may, Madam Chair. Professor, in respect of that request that you were taken to, that is the request of the 29th of March. Now, I appreciate around 29th of March, you probably had a fair bit on your plate. So executing documents that are, as Ms. Davidson describes it, just a formal process are probably not ones that occupy a great deal of your time and attention. But to come back to it, that was a formal request for assistance by Victoria Police for the enforcement in respect of all directions that were then in place. Is that so?
Well, it would have been to assist authorised officers, and those authorised officers would have had specific powers depending on the authorisation that was provided to them individually.
Yes, and those authorised officers included, excuse me, a substantial number who had been authorised in respect of ensuring that hotel quarantine was being enforced and observed.
Some of them, I'm sure that would have been the case, absolutely, because the program was stood up at that time.
So this request dated the 29th of March, even though broader than just hotel quarantine, was at least intended to capture, in part, hotel quarantine assistance if required.
Yes, I think the intention was to apply to authorised officers in the execution of their powers in whatever respect. Yes,
and just finally, your evidence earlier, and I just want to see if it remains the same in respect of this now that you've been taken to it again, is that insofar as what the police would actually do within hotel quarantine after you've deployed this request, you left that to those that were running hotel quarantine to determine the extent of that involvement.
Yes, it's always the judgment of the authorised officer that they need to exercise their powers in accordance with the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities and within the limits of the delegated powers, not delegated, the authorised powers under the Act specific to them.
Yes, and if there was to be a role of Victoria Police presence on the ground at the hotels, that was a decision that you left to those running Operation Soteria to make in conjunction with the police.
Correct.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. That concludes the questions I have for you. Madam Chair, unless there are... Oh, of course, Ms Harris.
I'm very regretful to ask for leave to ask a question about one issue, Madam Chair. I know Professor Sutton has been in the chair giving evidence for a long time, but I would be quick, and I imagine it might be preferable to come back after lunch.
I imagine that's so. Is it, Professor Sutton, you'd rather complete your evidence now and be excused?
If at all possible, that would be great.
Yeah. Yes.
Madam Chair, it just relates to a question that Professor Sutton was asked about the cohorting of COVID-positive individuals in a specific hotel.
Yes, I'll grant you that leave, Ms Harris.
Thank you. Professor Sutton, I understand your evidence was that you were not involved in giving a recommendation about the cohorting of COVID positive individuals in a hot hotel. I wanted to ask you about Dr. Finn Romanis and his role as the Deputy Public Health Commander Planning. Was that role intended to be a role under the emergency management framework that had also a reporting line up to the State Controller with the Public Health Commander?
The Deputy Public Health Commanders, all four of them, reported to the Public Health Commander who reported to me. So I wouldn't say that it's a report directly into the State Controller, but Dr. Romanis in particular was engaged in advice on policy and other guidance matters to Operation Soteria more than most, but it was it was more in the liaison role than a direct line of command.
And you're probably aware that Dr. Romanis has given a statement, but that has been tendered rather than him coming to give evidence orally. He gives some evidence about having been consulted about the idea of putting COVID-19 positive individuals within the hotel quarantine program into a dedicated hotel from the 30th of March, and then subsequently being asked further questions about his views on cohorting. Was that the intended line of public health input into those questions, that Dr. Romanis, if consulted, would be giving his views about those matters?
I'm not sure. I think Dr. Romanis would probably have to respond to that directly. But as a public health physician like myself, he's qualified to give advice on that matter of cohorting, and I think it's well known that the idea of cohorting is one that helps to minimise risk in terms of those who might be exposed, both as cohorted individuals together, but also in the staff or clinical staff who look after them.
Thank you, Professor Sutton. So really we should be looking, in terms of this specific advice given, we can go to Dr. Romanis' statement, and that may not have been advice that you were copied into or involved in if it was given in meetings, for example.
That's right. Dr. Romanis and I discussed the idea of cohorting and agreed that as a general principle, it has public health merit.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Professor Sutton. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Nothing further, Mr. R.
No, there's not, Madam Chair. And can I apologise to Ms. Harris for jumping in there. If there's nothing else, may we thank Professor Sutton for his work and for joining us today, and excuse him.
Yes, thank you,
Thank you,
Professor
Mr. R.
Sutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your attendance, and you're now excused. So you can turn off both your camera and your microphone. Thank you. We'll take a break now until 2:15, Mr. R.
As the board pleases.
Thank you.